Our purpose is to inform and raise awareness and generate debate about social development issues in the world, and in particular Sweden's role in these issues. And today we will specifically focus on Sweden's role as a development aid actor. And if you find this interesting, and if you would like to be a part of FIFLund, you are very, very much welcome to become a member of FIF. We have a magazine team, and we also have an event team, which are represented here today. And there are many benefits of being a part of this organization, not the least to take part of our internship programs, mentorship programs, and all of these events that you can be a part of and host. So if you want any more information about this, feel free to contact us through our email or through our social media pages, which you can find on the screen. Now, the event for today, we will start off with some brief presentations of our guest speaker, Lennart, who's here today, who will present his lecture for us. After that, we will have a Q&A session. If you would have any questions during the lecture, you are welcome to write them in the chat and we will ask them. Otherwise, you are welcome to save all your questions to last when we open up the floor for questions and discussions. Yes, so now we welcome our speaker, Lennart, who will tell us everything about Sweden's role as an aid actor.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, I should very much appreciate if as many as you as possible would show your faces. It's easier to talk to faces, even if they are very small, than to talk to black boxes. So I appreciate as many as possible show their faces. That's much easier. Thank you very much. I'm Lennart Wohlgemuth. I have been a guest professor in Gothenburg University in African Studies, but with special direction toward European and Swedish development and cooperation policies. I have also been director of Nordic African Institute for 13 years and have also passed in the in development cooperation field, many years at SIDA, foreign ministry and so on. But I have concentrated for the past 20, 30 years in actually research on development cooperation. I'm going to talk, I hope you will not be happy with what I'm going to talk about, because I'm not going directly to answer the question if Swedish aid really matters, but I'm going to talk around it quite a lot. And then you can, of course, ask questions when we come to the final end. And I'm going to talk about development cooperation in a time which is very unsecure and very unruly, where very many problems and questions arise that were not so eminent if we go back 10, 20, 30 years ago, where development cooperation could be seen as an act of solidarity which was not really related to so many other things. And I come back to what I mean by this. So if we look at the world today, and I think that is very important when we talk about international relations, and development cooperation is part of international relations. We see a world that is changing very, very rapidly. Politically, we see a change from an hegemony which has been dominating the period from the Second World War, with the United States, Europe in the center, towards new hegemonic powers growing very rapidly and taking over more and more of the scene when it comes to influencing what is happening in the world. And I can just mention the enormous rapid development of China, which has been very important. And this affects not only politics, also affects economics and trade relations and all kinds of developments that take place. So that is one of sort of major changes. The second change is when it comes to what we call global goods, international global goods, which are such actions or policies that cannot be dealt with by one nation alone. Climate is one very typical example, but the pandemic, how to work it in a period of pandemics is another. I mean, it's where one nation's actions is very important, but is only part of the solution. It really requires that we all act together. I mean, if Sweden is very, very active and very successful when it comes to climate, it still doesn't solve our problem when it comes to climate change. We need to work together. And these different, and there are quite a few such areas, and they are more and more global and more important to tackle, and where they have to be tackled jointly. These are called global public goods, and it's something that if you haven't heard about that before, you should keep in mind, because this is going to affect very much of our developments and the discussions and dialogues, international dialogues in the coming years. And many of these issues are of such nature that if they are not tackled properly, they are going to lead to serious problems for us all, as you can see from the discussion when it comes to the climate. We also have some quite interesting developments that are taking place. I mean, where actually developments goes in very different directions. I mean, if you take, we have had the period of globalization in the world, very rapid globalization, which has changed. I mean, it's in, for someone who with my age and who can look back to this almost to mid 20th century, in 1950, 1960, 1970. I mean, this is what has happened when it comes to globalization is incredible. And it has, of course, very much to do with communications, with the internet, with the mobile telephones. I mean, with all kinds of, which has made the world to a global village. I mean, the point of global village has been talked about very much also in the past, but now it's much more true. I mean, when I lived in Tanzania many years back, if someone traveled into the interior of Tanzania, they were lost. I mean, you couldn't contact them. Today, every village in Tanzania has a mobile telephone. I'm not saying that every person has a mobile telephone, but there is availability to mobile almost in every village, which means that people are interconnected in a way that never before. At the same time as we have this globalization, we have a development that goes in the opposite direction, and where countries are going apart and even divided internally in the countries, a sort of fragmentization. And this has become very, I mean, you can see it in Europe. I mean, Yugoslavia is a good case in point. One country that has fallen into a number of pieces, but you have it still when it comes to in Britain. Scotland is trying to there is a lot of discussion of breaking free from United Kingdom. In Spain, you have the same, but all over the world, it takes place it develops in different ways. In Nigeria, for example, the country decided to be a federal state at independence. 3 countries with 3 states. Today there are 36 states in Nigeria. So also where you have states which try to keep together, I mean, they are falling apart in different ways. Sometimes organized when it comes to Nigeria, sometimes very unorganized when it comes to the internal strife now in Ethiopia, for example, or in many other places around the world. So you have that divide, globalization, fragmentization. But you also have an interesting development when it comes to democratization and development towards more autocracy. We have had a very, in beginning of the 1990s, there was a third wave of democratization in the world, with many new democracies coming, and this was partly as a consequence of the fall of the Soviet Union. But it became so all over the place. But from early 2000 onwards, we have had a wave back from democratization towards autocracy. And today we can see around the world that different kinds of autocracy, different kinds of populism that is coming up, which is sort of also a sort of a conflict going in 2 directions at the same time: democratization on one hand and autocratization on the other. I mean, we have a lot of very complicated developments taking place. And I'm going to talk about development cooperation in that context. Now, before I do that, there is another contextual issue which I want to keep in mind, which personally I think is extremely important, and it hasn't become less important in the past few years. That is the question of interaction between poor and rich countries are not only a question of aid. It's actually every policy that Sweden decides upon has its implication when it comes to our relation with third world countries. Agriculture is probably the best example, where agriculture policy since Second World War has been extremely controlled. For example, in Europe, we have a joint European agriculture policy. It's not as Sweden cannot decide about the agriculture policy. It's a joint European EU policy. And that, like also American policy and all other rich countries in the world, is very restrictive. It introduces quantitative restrictions, which means that we only allow a certain amount of goods to come into Sweden. Why is this important? Because a country, a poor country, where most people live in the countryside, probably their comparative advantage when it comes to development is in the agriculture sector. If they produce agriculture products, they cannot sell it to Europe or to any other rich country. I mean, the idea with a modern theory on development is that you work very much with trade, that you export goods where you are good at producing, for example, agriculture product if you are a poor country, and you use these export incomes to pay for your imports of development goods of different kinds. And then this is a way of, theoretically, it's a way of how to develop. And aid is supposed to support that sort of process. If a country has its comparative advantages in agriculture, then aid should actually support that, so that to make it the development process quicker in that country. But if we at the same time have an agriculture policy which don't allow any of the developing countries to sell agriculture products to us, then these two policies go in different directions. And this is so with many. I mean, agriculture is one area, trade is another area, migration policies, Swedish migration policies has enormous replications on developing countries. Our environmental policies, our defense policies, I mean, all of them are very important for developing countries. And usually they are much more important than the aid as such. And this is something in Sweden, we introduced a policy on global the policy for global development, PGU. I translated it from Swedish. Policy for global development many years back. This is the last major sort of the bill on development cooperation that we have, which emphasizes that there should be coherence between different policies of Swedish government, and that our relationship is not only a question of aid relationship, it also contains a lot of other relationship, which it's our agriculture policy, it's our trade policy, and they should all be coherent with each other. They should relate to each other. One shouldn't go against the other. And the idea is that the objective for all policies should be to support countries to develop sustainable and economic and sustainable development for all countries. So at least in theory, we have a policy in Sweden which should require that all policy areas of the Swedish government works for more economic development and more sustainable development in the poor countries in the world. This is called coherence policy. This is something that also EU has introduced. So I mean, most European countries are at least have some type of policy when it comes to the coherence. And I want to underline that, because I mean, development cooperation as such, or aid as such, is only a very small part of our relationship with the developed world. And if we don't align sort of the other policies to aid, then aid can never do make any real change. So that is more on the context. Now, looking at the development cooperation, I want to underline particularly the motives why we should continue with development cooperation, or why development cooperation is something that is not something that you can say from tomorrow we will stop. I mean, at the bottom, and what has been sort of the overriding motive for Sweden for many, many years is a humanitarian policy of solidarity. I mean, we decided in 1962 in the government bill at that time, this is the first bill on development cooperation, that we could not see development in the world where some countries became richer and richer and others would just fall outside. We had to, like we had done internally in Sweden, we had a solidaric policy that had led to our quite positive development, and that we should, from there on, from 1962 on, of solidaric reasons, support also poor countries. That was a major objective. Now, this is partly questioned. It has been questioned for quite some time, and it's partly questioned today. And some other motives, which are of the same dignity, which points at that development cooperation would, it's not so easy to say that we are not solidaric anymore, so we stop development cooperation, because there are a number of reasons why we are of very reasons of our own I'm trying to translate again, upplyst egenintresse, enlightened self-interest. Why enlightened self-interest? Yes, I talked about global public goods before. I mean, we are not coming away from the situation that we have to, we want to see that we are going to survive, and we will have a climate in the world that makes us surviving in the future. That it's not only a question of working well in Sweden. We have also to set aside some support to the poor countries who cannot afford themselves to fulfill their requirements to tackle the climate issues. The pandemic, I mean, the easiest example is now today. I think today or yesterday, WHO, together with World Bank, IMF, and WTO, went out on jointly to say to the world that you have to set aside, the rich countries, you have to set aside funds to make it possible to vaccinate the poorer part of the world who cannot afford it themselves. And this, I mean, we are going to continue. You can call it something else than aid, but it's of the same dignity. But that is the second motive. I mean, to be able to implement important policies where we have a certain part of self-interest, going to make development cooperation continue as it has done up to that date. The third important motive is we want to uphold a world that is built on the building blocks that we have defined since the Second World War within the UN system, of democracy, of human rights, of equality between the sexes, of all kinds of values. It's also a very important reason why we should continue with our development cooperation, with our aid. So what I'm saying is that there are additional reasons to the basic reason, for solidarity with poor people, that makes it probable, I'm not saying more than that, probable that development cooperation will continue, even if some politicians talk about cutting development cooperation today, because there are strong elements of self-interest into that. Now, we are looking at development cooperation today. There are two major international agreements that are the basis for development cooperation. One is regards to the content of development cooperation, and the other one is on methodology. When it comes to the content, I refer to the agreement from 2015 on how, can any one of you tell me what I'm talking about now?
Paris Climate Agreement? Paris Climate Agreement?
Once again?
Paris Climate Agreement?
That's a part of it, but what is the major?
Sustainable Development Goals. Right?
The Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, the world agreed 2015, after very long negotiations, on a set of goals which I want to refer to as survival strategies for the world, or for the human beings. It contains goals when it comes to environment and climate and the sustainability part. It contains goals when it comes to economic development, and it contains goals when it comes to social development, equality, health, education, and so on. There are many, many goals, and they all sort of define how we are going to, what we have to do in order to tackle our joint problems of the world and make it possible for the mankind to survive. The difference between these new goals compared with what the Millennium Goals, which were at place before, is that before it was a question of the rich countries pay and the poor countries implement. It was very much a question about halving the poverty level of the world and more education for all and health for all and so on. But from 2015, it was not possible anymore to talk about we pay, you do, that, because now we have come to a situation where we all need to do things very urgently. It's not only the poor countries who have to do things, it's all countries who have to do things. And so the packages of what to do is really a question of both what is sort of the agenda for development cooperation. So from these goals, you can see very clearly what we should do when it comes to all kinds of areas of problems solving. But they are also goals which really relates to ourselves, to Sweden, to France, to Britain, to China, to United States, every country in the world. These have to be handled differently, and aid sort of part of the goals are taken care of by the Foreign Ministry and SIDA to implement, while the more internal looking are taken care of by all departments of the government that relates to these issues. I mean, just to take an example, when it comes to climate, to prepare for a more complicated word when it comes to climate is to build and to prepare for the ocean to expand and come and overflow part of the world. I mean, this has to be done in time, of course. So it doesn't, and it requires a lot of work in Sweden, for example, when it comes to preparation, when it comes to preparing for new levels of new sea levels. So these goals, particularly when it comes to development cooperation, they define very much the content on development cooperation. If you read any paper written by any donor today, you see the references all the way to Sustainable Development Goals, to the Agenda 2030. Every paper, every discussion. And before that, in the first part of this millennium, the references were made to Millennium Goals also. Now, when it comes to methodology, there has been, and this is an area which I have is very personal to me. I have been engaged for 40 years in these questions. And when I worked at SIDA, I was responsible for methods development when it comes to development cooperation. One of the major questions when it comes to development cooperation is that the donor wants to see things done. I mean, we define what is important and we want to see it done, and therefore we get very much engaged in implementation. While development is really something that takes place in another country by other people. If they are not on board, or if they are not in charge when it comes to their own development, I mean, you can do a lot of things from outside, you can, but there will be no sustainable results. And this is something that if you go back and you see, this was already in the first government bill in 1962, It was very clear there that, I mean, they talked about the motive for development cooperation was solidarity. They talked about that the goal for development cooperation was to combat poverty, and they talked about that the method was help to self-help. That what we do is to help someone who knows what they are going to do, and we assist them in the implementation. But if on the recipient side there is no one who is interested or who understands what we want to do, then there will be very little response, as you can understand. Now, this was in the first bill. It was repeated during the 1970s very clearly in what it was at that time called country programming approach. And it was then again in 2005 agreed upon after lengthy discussions in another Paris agreement on development effectiveness. And it was built on evaluations and assessments that had been done during the 1990s, looking at that it was really too dominating and actually didn't lead to very much results because of it wasn't anchored, it wasn't owned by the recipients. And this goes under the term nowadays ownership, and is centerpiece when it comes to the methodology. I want you to have back in your mind that the content really is very much, what steers the content today is very much the question of sustainable development goals. And when it comes to the methodology, it's very much a question of development effectiveness. And that is, I mean, it's more than ownership. It's defined, I mean, the agreement in Paris is actually 5 points, but it centers around the question of ownership. This is still not undisputed and very difficult to, and now I come to the real question of today, development cooperation in a very uncertain world. I mean, I try to explain or to start with that we are in a world where everything is really questioned. We have populism, we have autocracy, we have a very difficult time in many countries for democracy to develop. We have a lot of oppression. We have and it's even in countries which are still keeping to some kind of democracy, it's still very, very difficult to uphold these values that we see are so important for development. Not only for, it's not, and I want to underline that, I'm not talking about Western values or Swedish values. I'm talking about values that are internationally agreed, that has been international conventions within the Red Cross or within the UN, and that all countries have signed that adherence to. So I'm not talking about any sort of, of course, there is a lot of misuse of all kinds of development, even when it comes to these value issues. But the basis for this should be what is internationally agreed upon long ago. And in order to implement that in a world in which we are now, and also to implement difficult issues when it comes to tackling the global goods issue. I mean, to convince a country or a government, for example, in Brazil, that it's of life importance not only for Brazil but for the whole world that Amazonas Delta is treated in a proper way. I mean, these issues are extremely difficult to implement from outside. And it conflicts then very much with the ownership issue I talked about before. So what should we do in the world if I take an issue that I am sure you all think is very important, and that is treatment of women in the world. That there should be equality between sexes, and that women shouldn't be mistreated and mishandled like they are in so many places in the world. How should we tackle that? I mean, I think most would agree we cannot just be bystanders and say it's up to them to solve. Of course, it is up to them to solve, but I mean, we cannot stand by and not do anything. So what do we do? One way of doing it is to use the stick and to shame countries and to blame countries and to. Another way is then to try to work with the country and to try to use what is called dialogue in a very broad sense. To discuss, to uphold our relationship over a long period so that they trust us, to have visitors coming to Sweden to show how we implement certain facts and relations, and have continuous dialogue. And sometimes it seems very hopeless. And then the question is, should we withdraw? My personal view is we should be very careful to withdraw, particularly from countries we know and where we have worked very long, because things change. I mean, I gave you the latest development. You never know if you tell a story. Tomorrow it can be turned. But I'll still take that as an example because Tanzania has been close to my heart for many decades. They had a very autocratic ruler. He wasn't corrupt really, but he was autocratic and he was oppressive, and he oppressed the civil society. He was very chauvinistic and oppressed women, and he made it difficult for the press. And on top of all, he denied that Corona was dangerous. So in the end, he died in Corona. And a big part of the government, actually. His predecessor, his vice president, women from Zanzibar and Muslim on top of that. Everybody thought she was just in the shadows, and she came in, and she has in 2 months, without any big signs or gestures, or she has made fantastic changes. She says that she keeps to the old policy in order to avoid the conflicts with the vested interest of different kinds. But she really changes everything. She has changed the relationship with the NGO sector, with the civil society. She has opened up for the press. She has opened up with the opposition. She has opened up for the private sector, who felt very oppressed under the present. She has opened up the relationship with the neighbor states, where they had big conflict. And this happened overnight because one person died and another came in. And had we left, now we have the opportunity to carefully implement in a form of dialogue and perhaps advise and give support to areas which were very difficult just 2 months ago. And we have similar cases all around the world. Sometimes it gets worse, sometimes it gets better, and we have the opportunity. So development cooperation is not an easy task. to make, because what we are talking about when we are talking about development is change of attitudes among people. I mean, people in a country who want to go from one concept of development to another, they should decide themselves if they should do that. And if they want to do that, it's a very complicated process. It's very often very conflictual because the old generation feel very hurt. And the new generation glides away very rapidly from the old generation. And it's very complicated to make these changes. It takes time. It requires a lot of patience. And in that process, development cooperation is very complicated. It can be very negative in a process like this if it acts wrongly. It can be actually push things back. But it can also be very useful if it is enacted in a positive way. If I had time, and I don't have more time now, I would have given you a lot of anecdotes where I would describe how this in practice works. I have many of these. Let me just give you one story before I end. And that is from a country who you don't see as a developing country anymore, but it was when at the time when I was there. I was at that time chairman of an UNESCO organization, Institute for Education Planning in Paris. And I was invited to China together with 4 other international experts to participate when they were planning for their higher education sector for the coming 30 years, because they foresaw that the development would be very rapid, and they required a lot of infrastructure when it comes to the higher education. It was 100 Chinese and 4 experts from outside, and it all was in Chinese. And they gave us 1 day each to present the European case, the American case, the Japanese case, and I think the Australian case. And they took down note of everything we said. And they discussed it, and they discussed for a full week. And in the end, they agreed on the way ahead. They had listened to us, but they have only taken points which were useful for them. They knew where they were heading. They listened to outside advice. This is the dialogue I'm talking about. And they picked what was appropriate for China. I think that was perhaps the best example of capacity development and sort of support in form of dialogue. And every country needs that, of course. I mean, every country, when they tackle new areas, when they are going to, they need a lot of advice from outside. But the important thing is how this advice is given. And that is the question of ownership again. Okay, that leaves you a quarter of an hour for questions. Do we have any questions so far?
Yes, we do. First of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture. And we have questions that have been sent to me, of which the first one is, given the many years that you have worked for SIDA, maybe it's a broad question, but could you pinpoint any maybe specific ways in how the organization has changed over the years in their work strategies? If there are any major changes that you have seen over the years that you have been active?
At SIDA or in the world? Or
SIDA.
Oh, I mean, we are talking about SIDA is now, it was created in 1965. So it's now 70 years plus. Is it right? No. 65, 60. That is 35, 45, 55 years plus. Of course, the world is very different. First of all, if you want to see a linear change, yes, there is a linear change. I mean, SIDA, when it started, was working with project on a very project-to-project level. Supporting Kenya Science Teacher College, supporting the building, supporting the training of teachers, supporting with some teachers, expert who worked at the school for the first 5-10 years, and so on. Lot of projects like this. This has developed towards sector support. I mean, now it's not one school, it's a education sector where Swedish support goes to building schools, to training teachers, to developing teaching materials and so on. So I mean, this sense, it had changed very much. And at one time it went so far as to budget support, which means that Sweden gave support to a country's budget, where we then indicated in what area it should deal with, and where there were a lot of conditions on how accounting and reporting and so on. This is not so anymore. We don't have any budget support. So I mean, but basically there has been a lot of change from sort of very small to much bigger. What has not changed, or what has sort of gone up and down, is the question of methods. I mean, originally it was donorship. It was very much Sweden decided, we know what to do in this certain area. In Sweden, we are good at technical schools, for example, and then we gave support to that. And then we had a period of ownership, very strong ownership in the 70s. And then we had a period so it has gone up and down when it comes to methods. And presently, it's very complicated to see where we are, but we are, the 2005 agreement on ownership and development effectiveness is not very high on the agenda today. If you mind 1 second, I'm going to take a glass of water. Is that okay? Sorry. So I mean, when it comes to methods, presently, it's very doubtful where we stand. There is, SIDA is working on to revive the question of ownership again, on development effectiveness. But in the world, I think this doesn't have a very strong following. Okay, next question.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. Sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was wondering whether there has been a change in the dimension of, in the focus of development aid and the Swedish policies. Has it become more important in the agenda of Swedish politics over the years? Like, for example, in budgetary terms, or I don't know, just symbolic terms?
Presently, of course, it depends, of course, who is it and rule in the seat of government. Presently, we have a government that sticks to the 1% target, which was decided already in 1968. basically has been through all the years. But of course, there is a lot of discussion today, and many parties are questioning the quantity of aid. And that's why I brought up these issues of that there are multiple of motives. And if you cut aid, you might have to find ways of finding other monies for climate purposes, for pandemic purposes, and so on, because we will have to act when it comes to these areas.
So would you say that Sweden should stick to the 1%?
Yeah, but it's very unclear, of course, who is in charge after next election. So and there is a strong tendency. There is a lot of questioning on development cooperation. So it's up to the voters for the next vote.
Doesn't it also depend on the effectiveness of the aid? Like in terms of like how you can sell it to the people, that you actually show that, okay, we can actually see a causal link somehow?
I mean, if you want to cut aid, then you start questioning the effectiveness of aid. I mean, as I said, aid is very difficult, extremely difficult. If you want to see results now, then you will not be able to defend development cooperation. But if you want to look at a long period, I give you one example now. I come into my anecdotes. Bangladesh at independence in 1974, they had 6 children per woman. Sweden started to give a strong support to family planning. We helped them to build up the system, the norms, the methodologies, and so on. And we supported it for many years. And then we slowly cut it down after many years. And now I had an essay the other day from a student showing that presently the number of children per woman today is 2.1, which is the same as in Sweden or in Europe, basically. So it took 74 to 2021 to make a major change. It's very questionable how much effect the aid had in this, how much other effect. I mean, for example, the enormous development when it comes to industry development in Bangladesh, where women got jobs, of course, had a very strong effect. But I mean, you can see that there has been a very positive. What we wanted to see has happened. It took 50 years, and it's questionable. It's questionable how much effect really the aid had in that. That shows how difficult it is. And I can give you hundreds of examples of that nature, where there really has been change, which was seen originally as an enormous mistake. I mean, you can't imagine how much questioning SIDA had for the major paper factory in Vietnam, Bai Bang, during 20, 30 years. And now it's seen as one of the best projects ever. And it's actually a motor in a new modernization of Vietnam. So, I mean, it's so difficult to look at aid effectiveness in terms of results from aid and draw conclusions. If you draw conclusions from the dollars that you put in yesterday, you will probably see very bad results. If you look at what you did 20, 30 years ago, you might see quite some interesting. I mean, South Korea is a case of successful aid. It was as poor as the African countries were at that time. Okay, I'm long at my answer. So one more question then.
Yes, we have received many, but we can take one more, which goes like this. While Sweden is an exemplary development donor, it is also a major exporter in the global weapons trade. How can these two realities be reconciled? as the weapons trade reinforces authoritarian regimes and exacerbates violence against women and children, can Sweden's role in it be justified?
Yeah, this is probably the best example of coherence. I mean, Sweden, like every other country, has policies that goes in different directions. And in this case, it's clear. And Sweden was rated, has been rated many times, but it was rated international on its international relations and had so many positive rates. But when it came to weapons sale, it was one of the worst cases. I mean, Sweden per capita is a very big weapons sales. So I mean, it really points out it's extremely difficult with coherence. I mean, everybody would say that agriculture policy or weapons policy is such that it would be easy politically to make a decision to change the policy. But it really, when it comes down to interest groups, and here we have weapons production is a very good job creator in Sweden. And it's also an industry that sort of creates technology. It's on the forefront of technology. So you have certain vested interest groups and particularly people who lose their jobs, who will fight nails and tails to continue that sales. So I mean, it's very complicated. If you come to agriculture policies, I mean, in France, for example, the farmers would go out, all of them, and they have already done it. They came in with tractors and put manures on the streets of Paris when it came to any question of cutting down in European agriculture subsidies. And these subsidies are extremely contradictory to the development of poor countries. So, I mean, you see this, and what is important for an outsider to comment on this is that it is that policymakers, politicians who make a decision on, for example, weapons sale, they should be very aware of the consequences, not only of jobs in Sweden, but also of consequences when it comes to weapons use in other countries. The same, and you can see from the press, I mean, this is actually coming up in Sweden, and there is a strong pressure on Swedish government presently and they have changed policy, but not very much so far. Okay, should we stop here?
Do you possibly have time for one final question?
Okay, one final question.
Okay, which is that, what is the role of local anchoring in aid?
Local?
Anchoring, that you have the local connection in the development of aid.
In Sweden, you mean?
Abroad, I interpret it.
You mean for ownership, local ownership?
Yeah.
And you mean local, not country ownership?
I don't have more information than what it is written, but what is the role of local anchoring?
No, it's a very good question, and it's actually a full lecture. To summarize, I mean, same as I say between a donor and a recipient government, that there should be ownership. It's also true in the next stage. I mean, development doesn't take place in a government. It takes place out in the countryside or in the city, among the civil society, in the industry. And if the link between the donor, it's not easy to be a donor, because you would have to, particularly if you are a bilateral donor, a government, you have to act one way or another in relation to the government in that country. But you have to see that government actually also relates to the beneficiaries. And the Swedish aid, there has been a change in Swedish aid. Actually, Swedish aid puts a lot of importance of the final beneficiaries. And it's called right principle. And rights means that you should always keep the beneficiaries and their rights on high in the focus. I mean, it's complicated, but it's a basis for development cooperation. I mean, otherwise you will not get change. I mean, you don't change on a macro level. You have to, and that's why a sort of ownership has to entrench the whole government, like the whole country. Okay, it was very nice meeting you all. Some of you I've seen now the faces, others black boxes. It was very nice to meet you all. Thank you.
And from us from Fuflund, we thank you very much for being able to join us today and for wanting to share all your knowledge with us.